know how this works. I think at this point, smashing out is just us a random conversation. Like imagine you are, I mean, Elliot, I heard last time we spoke that you like pops. Do you still like pops?
I like what, sorry?
Pops, like beer and stuff.
Oh, beer. Yeah, I
Yeah.
do like beer. I don't have one with me now though.
That's okay. But let's just imagine that you walk in a bar and there is, Elliot sitting there, sitting like all by himself, very alone, very sad, and just looking for a human
Always.
connection. It's the human
That's usually
connection.
the case.
Yes. Here we go. And here you come, you arrive and you see Elliot there. What would you ask Elliot? I mean, first of all, probably, may I sit here? That's probably would be just
Oh my
reasonable.
God.
Otherwise, it would be just rude, right? Anything else that you would like to ask him first? Anybody? Feel free to unmic yourself and just ask. Oh, probably I should introduce Elliot first. I mean, maybe you don't know Elliot, but Elliot, like if you walk in a bar and Elliot is sitting there, probably like, dealing with type, because this is like he probably dreams in letters and characters and typography and all. And
Always.
Elliot has been wearing many different hats. We used to work, I mean, we had a project, a big smashing redesign, like what, 27 years ago?
Yeah, 27, 28,
28 years.
something like that.
Yeah, it was a long time ago. So Elliot is a designer. He's a musician. He also loves typography. He also works on the Google Fonts team now. Google Knowledge team. Google Fonts Knowledge.
Google Fonts Knowledge, that's it. Yeah.
Yes, I got
Bit of
it
a
right
mouthful,
after
but
all.
yeah.
Writing a lot about type, thinking a lot about type, and also designing with type in mind. Did also a lot of other things in his life as well. Of course, from publishing a wonderful magazine with his wonderful wife,
Oh,
to also doing web design. Are you a web designer, Elliot?
I don't know if I am still a web designer. Maybe a recovering web designer. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
that's okay. But also a musician. So this is everything you want to ask. Jock, go.
Okay. I have an audience that are elderly people who can't see very well, and I put a huge amount of work into selecting my font. And the font that I picked was something called Source Sans Pro, which
Yeah.
Gareth, I think it was Gareth Ford Williams did research on, and I believe it is let me think. Source Sans Pro is the font that was developed by Adobe about 7 or 8 years ago. It's a free font, but the font that I really wanted was the one that the BBC spent a fortune on. I think it was the BBC or the Guardian. And then I wrote to them, "Can I use your font?" And they said, "Well, we're very gratified, but we choose not to let our font go because it's a customized font." And I wanted to know how likely is it that an organization, it was either the BBC or the Guardian, will eventually let other entities like me use their font.
Yeah, oh, that's a really good question, Joe. Yeah, I mean, I would say that probably like because a lot of those typefaces, which are like completely bespoke projects, they're commissioned by the organization, by the brand. They paid a lot of money. They're generally quite expensive to do that kind of thing. Understandably, they kind of want to keep it to themselves. I mean, the main benefit of commissioning a custom typeface is to create something that is completely unique to your brand, so you don't have to use something that everyone else is using. So that's the main benefit of it. But that said, a lot of people do, depending on like the agreement they've come to with the people, the type foundry who are actually designing it, they might, depending on how they work their kind of licensing, they may set up an agreement where they have exclusive use for a number of years. And then after a set period of time, it may then go out to become a retail font. So something that the font foundry sell themselves via their own site or various different networks and whatnot. Or it could be something that they choose to make open source. I mean, I guess that would be probably unlikely. I can't think of an example of that. But the BBC example, you said that I believe they did a lot of like, they published a fair amount of research around that. I think even, was Gareth Ford Williams even involved in some of that, perhaps, who connected to that in some way?
if it wasn't him, it was another very well-known British dude who
Mm.
specializes in type fonts and who's I follow. He has a website and he's excellent.
So Paul Shaw, was he involved in that? Anyway, I'm not.
Who's that?
Paul, is it Paul Shaw from Commercial Type? Was he involved in that?
There were
might
three guys, and one of the guys was in Germany.
Yeah, I can't remember. But yeah, I mean, but the good thing about some of those projects though is that like a lot of research comes out of it, and in terms of fonts used for suitable for to be more accessible, there is so much interesting research happening now. Bonnie Traver-Shoup, who's behind the Lexend project, published a load of findings around that, and it's really interesting to see just how many type designers only recently, I think, are really kind of putting a lot of effort into doing things like making sure that certain characters are not simply mirrored versions, a D or a B or a P and a Q. They're making sure that the actual letter forms are changed in some way to aid with legibility. And it's really interesting to see a lot of work around that. Google Fonts have commissioned a bunch of stuff around that, and we have. So let me think. On Google Fonts Knowledge, we published an introduction to accessibility in typography and readability, and there are plans to expand upon that as well with a load of stuff that's coming out of a lot of research. So yeah. But in answer to your question, Jock, yeah, I think probably realistically, it's sadly unlikely for a lot of organizations to sort of give up their custom type projects, at least in the near future anyway.
I just took the liberty actually to adding a link in the chat, because I was actually having this project for a public institution, and my job was to try to find anything that would be open source that could be used across the a huge variety of different websites that I have on the platform. And I just pasted the link on the top. One of the ones that I found was this incredible typeface called Atkinson Hyperlegible.
Yeah,
and it's fully open source, and it's been designed by the Braille Institute of America. So that's that actually has been my recommendation, but I don't know if it's going to be used or not, right? But especially in those kind of situations where you want to make sure that it's fully accessible, and you want to make sure that it's kind of working well. It's really nice. So
yeah, no, that's yeah, there are a ton of them on Google Fonts as well, which is great. There's loads of this stuff that you can use for free. Oh, nice one.
Yeah, so that's the one, right? Also, I don't mean to spam everyone, but I just put together some of the things that I found in here on LinkedIn. So I pasted a link to this as well. Tons of really good things. Some of them actually released on Google Fonts as well. So that's pretty neat to see. So hopefully you'll find them useful too. All right. Anybody else has maybe any other question? Because I have some prepared, but I'm not important. It's all about what you are interested in. Anybody?
I saw someone ask how my dog was, which is nice. I've lost my chat now, but I'll see if I can find it.
Okay, let's see. Oh, we see some recovering web designers, so that's good.
I have a question.
Sure, go, please.
Elliot, I work as a designer in a group, like a web team, and in American government. And when I say typography matters, like I'm educated in typography from school and everything, but they say, well, what is it, and why does it even matter? Do you have a good canned response for that?
I am I kind of currently, it's funny you should say, because yeah, I am actually I've been seeking the perfect canned response to that question. And I'm currently let's
workshop it. Let's workshop it together.
Yeah, exactly. I'm currently writing a book at the moment, and trying to sort of open with that about why it sort of matters. And it's hard when you're kind of trying to explain to folks who just don't see the value in why not just use system fonts, and why should I care about any of this stuff. But I think it's easy if you can show in some really, really simple steps some small changes, some very literally showing people like, okay, what if you increase the line height slightly?
Right.
What if you bring in the measure so that you don't have these unruly line lengths? Like simple, like
Right.
just change one thing. And also I quite like to show people even in like very basic scenarios. So, you know, in a word processing app, in something, in a slide creation app, you know, it needn't be a
Right.
big design thing, a big brand thing, but just to show, you know, make this very small change and you start to see a lot of this stuff really come into
I
play.
agree.
And
Yeah.
a lot of I guess a lot of like a common mistake I think a lot of people make in terms of having a very like that you see a big thing is like a lack of language support in fonts, where you see it just screams at us on the web, where you see people haven't used a typeface that has glyphs in there for what you know, any kind of non-English
Sure.
Latin based stuff in there, and you see the example is always like, you know, it's fine because everyone's writing in English and it's no problem and it's all good. But then there's a blog post or there's a website footer where suddenly there's an office in say Norwegian city, and suddenly you've got some characters in there which are suddenly jumping out to you because they're huge and they're emboldened and this kind of thing, and it just looks so unprofessional. And this is the thing I find as well with faux italics. I have a real bee in my bonnet about this, and people say, why does that matter? Why does it? And you know, I see this all the time in kids' books. For some reason, like whenever we're reading these books at night, these picture books, oh my goodness, the amount of them that don't use true italics, and it's a lot of people will go, well, why does it matter? But a lot of the time, you kind of it's jarring in a way that I think even if you know, the novice type user doesn't necessarily pick up on in kind of, they won't go, wow, look at that, that's terrible, that's not a that's a faux italic that they've put in there. But there is a subconscious slight jarring there, I think, that happens with some of this stuff, where you're aware that it looks a bit weird and you're not quite sure why it looks a bit weird. This is another thing with people pairing typefaces as well, where they pair them and they're just a bit too similar, that there's not enough differentiation in there, that they're kind of gone, oh, I'm going to play it safe, I want something a bit different but not too different. And you've got to have enough contrast in there between them to kind of to kind of justify why you're trying to emphasize this particular bit of text, or why you're trying to make something look a little bit different. And yeah, it's typography matters because all of these kind of micro decisions that come into this, it gives you this framework for saying, you know, why should we do this? Why should we kind of make a little bit of effort? But you know what? Yeah, I am currently literally, well, not literally right now, but like in the process of doing this intro to this book, where I'm trying to find this way of succinctly kind of summing this stuff up. But I do think that showing people like some really simple small changes and seeing just how they go, oh wow, suddenly this makes a huge amount of difference. And a really important part of that as well is that technically typography doesn't really involve actually choosing typefaces. Like, of course, yes, we discuss all that as part of it, but you know, you can take a system font, you can take Times New Roman and do great typography with it, with some really thoughtful small changes. And showing people that, sometimes people go, oh, wow, like I had no idea that even though I'm stuck using this particular typeface for whatever reason, because of licensing or brands or whatever, actually there's a ton of stuff you can do with it. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Solidarity, at least solidarity for.
Yeah,
I'll keep an eye out for your book too.
Thank you. Cheers.
Then I'll just quote you. I'll say, "Hey, he says it."
Yeah.
Cheers.
From my end, I can actually only say that I remember vividly, and I think I brought it up once to Elliot a couple of years ago. I remember vividly us having this conversation when Elliot was redesigning Smashing Magazine back in, again, 27 years ago, right? And Elliot said once, talking about like how to mix typefaces, and he said, well, if you want something to be different, it needs to be clearly different. If something needs to be similar, then it needs to be very similar or identical. But the worst thing you can do is to make something look a little bit different and a little bit similar, because then people are confused, right? So it's either the same or clearly different. And so this is why, like, when you think about indentation, or you think about like spacing and all, it cannot be like 3 pixels. It's either 20, which would be a decision, or it's 0, which means, perfect alignment.
Yeah,
Right.
that's it. I've been obsessed with this for a long time. In Jason Santamaria, in his book on web typography, calls it that balance, and it's specifically talking about pairing typefaces. He's saying it's the balance between distinction and harmony. And I think that's the quote that I use all the time, because that is it, like balancing, making it distinct enough, but still fitting within the context of what you're trying to do. For pairing type is it, that's the framework for everything. But actually, I've been thinking about this recently, and it does apply to everything, like you say, Vitaly, like making sure that your heading is effectively a couple of pixels bigger, and it's like you say the equivalent of like 8 pixels bigger rather than just 1 or 2 pixels, to make sure it's different. Everything, color, and not just web design or whatever, right? It's just in life, we're just kind of looking at some new wooden worktops for our kitchen and looking at like tiles, and I'm like, oh, that looks really awesome, but is that texture, is that color different enough from that piece of wood? And it's everything. I think that thing of everyone wanting to feel that whatever they're looking at is part of a sort of cohesive system, but needing to understand that something is different for a reason, and if there's not a valid reason for it being different enough, then it shouldn't be different.
Your life must be very difficult, Elliot, when you go outside and you look at all the signs and Comic Sans and whatnot.
My wife's life is very difficult because of that.
Are you the one that complaining publicly? Do you like, I don't know, send messages to owners saying like, you really better fix it, otherwise I'm going to put a petition online and make everybody abandon you and never come back to you?
just rage, just throwing chairs through restaurant windows, that kind of thing,
I don't know. Yeah, so it's like
Elliot,
yes, please.
when you bring up font selection and font pairing, one of the questions that I have is, now that we have variable fonts and you have this super variable fonts like Recursive that have everything from monospace to serif to sans serif all in one package, do you still advocate using multiple fonts, or would you be okay with using that just one variable font that does everything and the kitchen sink?
That's a great question, Carlos. Yeah, I'm glad you asked that, because so whenever, even pre-variable fonts, whenever I've kind of written stuff about like pairing, one of the big things, and this is definitely something that I'm preparing for the workshop next week, is when you come to do font pairing, first asking yourself, do I actually need to introduce a secondary typeface here, or a tertiary one? Is it actually necessary for me to create further distinction in some way? And mainly that involves kind of looking at what the palette you have to paint with. So even pre-variable fonts, when you have, let's consider like a sort of a static, like a family that's got, say, 9 weights, like, that's more than bold italic and bold italic. You've got already there like quite a lot of variation you can have. If that family is maybe part of a super family, say, that's got a condensed width and it's got an expanded width, and so you've got suddenly all these different widths to play with at the same time as having the weights, then you've got a whole load of options. And again, maybe there's like a monospace version, and maybe there is there's a sans version, and there's a serif version, if you're thinking about kind of a lot wider super family, or as you say, like a monospace version. So even pre-variable fonts, I've always been an advocate of saying, do we need to look elsewhere, or do we already have the tools at our disposal within this palette to kind of do our work? And a lot of the time, to be honest, if you start to look at these larger families or super families, there's a bit of a gray area about exactly where you draw that distinctive line there. But even with that, there's just a ton of options that often it doesn't necessarily make sense to go elsewhere. When you consider, say, using let's just say a regular weight, standard width serif typeface for body, and then for a heading having like a sans and maybe a bold weight condensed sans, and then you want to have a pull quote or something, and you're going to throw in maybe the very wide, very thin version of that sans in there. Like already, like in 3 different elements, you got so much contrast that I don't think you necessarily need to look elsewhere. So with variable fonts, potentially you have all of those kind of options kind of baked into one font, plus all of those intermediary points on the axes where you can, you don't have to just choose between bold and extra bold. You can choose a value in between that, to really refine. And so, yeah, I still feel the same, whether variable or not. I think if the options are there, then it's really important to consider what options you've got to play with, and to not necessarily go, well, we have to use more than one typeface because that's just kind of how we do things. Obviously, with some stuff, you are not going to get maybe a different, wildly different sort of atmosphere or feeling from what staying within one typeface, and you want to have something that is drastically different, and that's a great validation for a great sort of reasoning for going off and using a separate typeface. But so I'm glad you said recursive, because recursive is awesome, because it actually has one of the few variable fonts that I can think of actually that has that kind of feel baked into it. So I think if I remember rightly, there's the what's it called? It basically, what is the axis? It basically goes between as well as it having like a monospace version in there and a proportional version. It also has this casual axis, where it kind of introduced these kind of friendlier curves, these kind of like the subtle flares on some of the letter forms. It's really cool. There's a cursive axis in there as well, so which you can use if you are switching it to italic. I think if you switch it to the italic, it automatically takes the furthermost cursive value, but you can also play with that if you're using the upright. So there are a ton of options, and I'm gonna throw in the URL there for it's on Google Fonts, but it also has quite a nice little microsite, which is recursive.design, which you should check out, because you can play with all of that stuff, and it's good fun. But I think that's a great example of a variable font that not only includes all of these different options which we traditionally think about, but really letting you play with exactly how casual you want something to be, or how formal you want something to be. And I'd love to see sort of more of those expressions making their way into variable fonts.
In general, Elliot, what would you say, where are we now with variable fonts? I remember that, like, that moment, I think 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 years ago now, when they just came out, and I thought that this is it. This is just changing everything. It felt like such a revolutionary thing. At the same time, maybe I'm wrong, but it feels like we're still in a position where whenever you're looking for any kind of typeface, or any kind of fonts, really, font weights or whatever, it's not easy to spot or to find something that would be a variable font. Usually it would be just a couple of font weights and that's it. Is it because it's very difficult to create variable fonts? And maybe it also would be a good idea to explain to everyone here on the call what the difference actually is.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, definitely check out, are you screen sharing, Vitaly? Yeah, okay. Let's see, we've got, yeah, if you have a look on Google Fonts, you can filter by variable fonts. Now on Adobe Fonts, you can do the same thing. So a few weeks ago, Adobe Fonts released their variable fonts, which have been a long time coming. It's something Google have been pushing a lot of. They've really been going down that kind of variable rabbit hole, and really pushing that out there and getting the word out there and supporting a lot of projects that promote variable fonts. And it's cool that Adobe are now doing that as well. And they have really interesting UI for playing around with it as well. I think it's super interesting. I don't think that it's necessarily like, now that variable fonts are here and they're widely accepted and supported in browsers and stuff like that, and design software, that everything should necessarily jump over to being variable, because there are still, there are loads of like technical advantages in terms of like, if you are serving a web font with more than it varies obviously, but say two to 4 weights, then it would actually make more sense to just serve one variable font file and use the axes to serve those different weights anyway. But the fact it's the expression thing. It's the idea that you can then tweak things exactly how you want. So we talked about recursive just now. That's kind of a good example. And if you're doing something like a logo where you want to have a particular lockup and there's a certain degree of customization that up until variable fonts you would have had to do by outlining the type and then manipulating it, you can now do that still with live type, which I think is really exciting. But I also call myself a variable font realist. So I recently switched to, I use the typeface Degular by Ono Typeco on my website, and I recently switched to the variable version of that, which has been a long time coming, and I realized I just needed to get on and do it. And I switched to that, and as I said on there, that I'm kind of a variable font realist, because switching between like one integer on the weight scale to me is like not hugely exciting for the most sort of work, and it's more about the general expression, plus things like optical size. That's where I think like variable fonts that include an optical size axis are fantastic, because it means that on one hand you've got this really cool, and Degular is actually a good example of that, where the extreme of the sort of display level optical size, you've got loads of contrast and like lots of tight spacing, and it's great for really large text. And on the smaller sort of body or sort of caption even side of the scale, you've got really generous spacing, some really nice ink traps to aid for like on-screen readability and stuff like that. And I love that you can manipulate all that stuff, but also that you can make that purely an aesthetic decision. You say, hey, you know what, for this particular business card, I want to have the type looking really meaty and chunky, and I'm not just going to use the weight axis, I'm going to also use the optical size axis to really like bring out some of that personality. But it's great also for very practical use in terms of just general readability, making sure that folks viewing it on a small screen are viewing it, and the type is relatively small, that they're getting the appropriate optical size for that, and they're not struggling to read just because we've chosen a typeface that we really love but is actually quite impractical to use the equivalent of say 14 pixels. And that's, I think, the power of variable fonts. It's not necessarily like moving between weight 742 and weight 743 on the scale. Like some people are into this. I'm personally
I mean, I don't mind at all, so it's fine. But I mean, if we had an opportunity to use Mija or Elena, which are the fonts that we're using as variable fonts, we probably would try out. But I've been, I don't know, probably being too difficult and pestering the type foundries. Is there a chance? And they're like, no, currently not, work in progress. So that's pretty much the standard answer I've been getting recently.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a type designer, so I don't want to speak on behalf of anyone to say how easy or difficult it is to make variable fonts. Obviously, there is, as I'm sure anyone can imagine, there is a degree more work to do it. But equally, if you are already creating different widths, right? And you're using a different master, 2 or more masters within your design, then you're kind of a long way there anyway. So yeah, there's I can see some type designers on this call. maybe Ty can tell us how easy it is to create a variable font or not. But yeah, I think it's it's great that the support is there and more people are realizing what they can do with it. I also think, just to come back to that thing we said about contrast before, about making sure that, say, your headings are significantly more bold than the body text. Mm-hmm. In some fonts, it's completely up to the type designer where they set those set those lines. What is the font? What is the bold? What is the extra bold? And it might be that in some typefaces you find that the bold isn't necessarily much more bold than a regular. Whereas if you've got the power of variable fonts, you can go, I'm going to push that, and instead of going to like to a bold that which would usually be at say 700, I'm going to go to bold at like 789 or whatever you have on the scale. That's closer to an extra bold, but it's not quite not quite as extreme as that. And that's so variable fonts are really useful for that kind of scenario as well, I think.
Can you spot 789 on a poster?
Definitely not.
Yeah,
definitely.
I don't think it. Any other
I don't like
question?
choice. Like I said, I'm a variable font realist. I'm the
Yeah.
kind of person that's in a restaurant and if there's loads of choice in a restaurant menu, I'm very upset usually. I'd actually prefer to have it kind of relatively minimal and well considered.
I can see Daniel unmuting himself. I can assume that
Yes,
Daniel has a question to ask here.
I have a
Hey,
question. Hi,
Daniel.
Elliot.
Hey,
Hi.
nice to see you.
You just mentioned you're not a type designer, but I remember a while back on Twitter you said, should I open a type foundry? Now you have all this.
Everything is coming back. It's a full
Yeah.
circle. Everything is coming back at you, Elliot, today.
You're in between fonts all the time, so at some points you're probably wondering how do these work and how do you actually make them. So I wonder, are you actually making font or getting into that as well?
Well, yeah, it's funny you should ask, Danny. I for a long time, I resisted the idea of doing any type design. And then I guess just because I've been so sort of immersed in the typography world, know a lot of type designers, know a lot of like type industry people. I've sort of been in that so deeply that I guess it's kind of rubbed off on me. And finally, I kind of got a bit of an itch to do a bit of type design. And so I got Glyphs Mini and I started like doing something, and oh my goodness, it was just terrible. just I mean, I kind of I kind of understand it from a sort of conceptual level, but from a practical level, I realized that I just had a whole ton to learn. So it's funny because since then, and so I've done a couple of things. Like I bought Dan Cederholm's type design course, which I think was League of Movable Type who did that, and another one, and I've been kind of like dipping in and out of these like type design resources. Ulrich Rausch's book is awesome, Designing Fonts, which I've absolutely love, and I've just been kind of pouring through that. And then one of my closest friends who lives in the same village as me is Jamie Clark, who is a type designer, and has promised to like sit down with me and give me like a full-on like this is how you do type design lesson, which I'm going to take him up on, I think, quite soon. So yeah, I've gradually become really interested in doing it. I'm definitely not at a point yet where I could like design anything decent, but I'm like, yeah, conceptually at a point where I thought of, yeah, I'm starting to think about what I could do and what I need to know. But yeah, I think at some point I will probably do a foundry at some point.
Okay, yeah, good luck.
Thanks. Cheers, Danny.
There is also one interesting question that also came from Jock, but just before going there, I do want to derail the conversation just a little bit, because one thing I actually wanted to ask as well is, you may be not designing fonts just yet, typefaces yet, but I know that you have a little thing behind your back there where you tend to compose music.
Yes, yeah, there's some machines there. I should have turned them on so there were like some flashing lights and stuff. That would have been cool.
Yeah, well, next time. There is always a next time for sure. But I mean, in general, I mean, do you see, I mean, this is actually something I wanted to ask you for a long time. Do you see this kind of connection between creating, like you're creating, like you're writing articles, you're creating, right? So you're designing typeface design and music. It all feels like this fact, or not fact, but this process of bringing something into this world. Do you feel like in many ways anybody who is deeply passionate about creating can then learn the skill and the craft to create in a different way? Or how did you actually move to music in the first place? Was it just a hobby that kind of just turned into something a little bit more bigger than a hobby? Or is it kind of different facets of the same passion?
It's a good question actually, Vitaly, because I think in some ways it's similar in that sense of, like you say, sort of desire to create something, desire to sort of create something from nothing, put something out there into the world. And I think that sort of, that kind of drive to make something is like, whether it's music or some design stuff or perhaps the forthcoming foundry, like that's all kind of the same, the sort of the different sides of the same coin effectively. But that said, in terms of like practical, like the process of making music versus doing design or writing about type or whatever, is quite different, I think, because I guess there's a lot in my kind of work, quote unquote work. It's more like that sort of commercial sense of what is kind of part of design, what it's doing to solve a problem, you know, to be a solution to some kind of problem. Whereas the music stuff is a much more kind of, I guess, sort of selfish in a way, like I'm sort of making it because I want to make it, and whether or not like that happens to please someone or resonate in some way like that would be great, but it doesn't have that same kind of I guess sort of commercial needs that my design sort of or day job sort of stuff does. So it's nice in that way because it's kind of freeing to create something that doesn't have those constraints and to do something that is just you know for its own sake, basically. Which is really nice. But they are really intertwined as well. So that's the weird thing, is that so music. So I've been doing music. I didn't really get serious about music until about 5 or 6 years ago. But I've been doing it like most of my life since I was a teenager. And my first kind of not professional, but like semi-professional design work all came out of music, basically. So I worked before university. I worked in the shop in Virgin Megastore when they still existed, and our managers there are a few of us who were musicians who worked on the shop floor. They allowed us to put out a CD, and I did the artwork for that CD, and I did the POS for it, the point of sale, and I did the website. And this was like the very first website I'd ever made, just using this WYSIWYG tool from back in the day called Homestead. And that was my entry point into design. And then when I went to university, my sort of portfolio at the end of it was not full of university work so much as it was full of like friends' bands. And this was all like flash sites back in the day. So it was like friends, bands, flash sites, and flash sites for my own like little music making project. That was
I'm sure
kind of
that's still very popular today, those websites that you created in Flash.
They don't exist anywhere, hopefully.
Probably not.
I'm hoping that they've long been erased from the web.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I did that, and then my first job out of uni was junior web designer for EMI Music, so the major record label, when they were still doing their own thing before they got bought by Warner or whoever it was. But that first like 2 years working at EMI, and then I worked at Sanctuary Records for a year. That whole time was just music stuff, basically. So lots of artist sites. Initially in Flash, then moving more towards sort of HTML, CSS once web standards kind of kicked in and everything. And so music and design have been kind of weirdly intertwined for me. And because I run a small record label as well, where I put out my music and music of others, I get to do design for all of that as well, which is really fun, because I get to just sort of mess around with different typefaces and just, you know, do whatever I want to do there. And then recently I've been doing some work for Luke Slater, who is an awesome artist who has a label called Motor Volva, and that he runs with his wife, and I've been doing some vinyl sleeves for them, which has been really fun. Again, as a like antidote to everything else, it's not really, it's kind of, I guess it's commercial because it's like work, but it's much more like, yeah, for fun, and it's more connected to kind of music. And
before you know it, we'll be speaking about Belgian techno, but just before doing that, let's maybe go back to typography for just a moment, because we also have a question from, I mean, we can't speak about Belgian techno a lot, but Jock is wondering, can we discuss how does one decide on the measure? Maybe Jock, you'd like to ask a question yourself?
Yeah, I'll just read it out. Please discuss how and to what extent, and how does one decide or measure the utility or the preference or the popularity of one font family over another family, and how is this done? I'm thinking about selecting fonts to how does one go about, you know, deciding upon Scotch whiskeys. I mean, I'm not a Scotch whiskey drinker, but my son is a Scotch whiskey drinker. He knows the subtleties between the things, the different types. I mean, he's been to Scotland and he's tasted these things. I have no understanding of that, but I'm just curious how much serious thought goes into selecting a font. And I'm just thinking of, these movie stars that go to the Emmys and the Grammys, and they're all look beautiful. And that didn't happen easily. They put a lot of thought into that. So when you have someone like George Clooney, who's always looked perfect, that didn't happen by itself. But I wonder how much thought goes into that. How does a company determine whether this is a good idea? How much respect does he give to his staff? And when a staff person says, boss man, I think we need to seriously change our font. I mean, how often does something like that come up?
Elliot, just before you answer, may I just interrupt for just a moment? Just two facts that I don't know, this is like a miracle. I just read this article the other week about George Clooney, and apparently he's been wearing the same suit for the last 20 years. He always have the same look, like always. So he just probably went to some sort of a hairdresser or anything once in his lifetime and said, this is it. It's going to be me forever. And the other thing, I just want to applaud you for your impeccable reading skills. That was beautiful. Okay, that's all. Elliot, please go.
Yeah, that's a good question, Joe. I mean, it's kind of, yeah, the big question, isn't it? So not saying this in any way to plug my own stuff, but only because it's kind of the top of my mind at the moment, because I wrote it quite recently. But I did, so part of the stuff I've been writing for Google Fonts Knowledge, I did an article that I'm going to paste in here, that is called a checklist for choosing type, and the idea around this is, so we launched Google Fonts Knowledge, and we had this whole module on like choosing type, so a bunch of different articles that would help you in theory kind of evaluate type and kind of work out what it was you were looking for. And then I kind of realized that there wasn't really one sort of cohesive piece of writing that kind of said, you know, this is all the stuff in a list. And I realized that when I was going through my own process of choosing type for different projects, that I was also kind of like, I was going through similar processes, but I was never really documenting it. I was never really like going, why am I placing this much weight on this side of the evaluation? Why am I giving this more preference, this kind of thing? So I wrote this checklist for choosing type. And it's also, I also put it on like a very small, literally, it is just a list version on GitHub as well, which I'll paste in there. But the idea is that there are these different kind of parts of the process that we should go through when we're evaluating type. And so the first thing is that it should suit the purpose of the project. Now, again, that sounds a little bit vague, but within that, it encompasses what is the emotional response type. And now I think in many ways, and you know what, we kind of really debated this for a really long time when we were putting this together, when we were putting Google Fonts Knowledge together, because a lot of people, when we reviewed the content, were saying, oh, you should put the emotional side of things first, because everyone, you don't have to be a type expert in any way to have a response, to have an emotional response to type. And so in some ways that should be the first on the list. And other people said, no, you should make sure you're weighing it from a very technical perspective and making sure everything's there that you need to be there, and then let the emotional stuff come towards the end and kind of be the final fact check. Now I ended up, and I still think there is an argument for either side of that, but I ended up recommending the emotional response first, because I really think that because everyone responds to the type emotionally, it can really make that difference. It helps you make that initial selection. So if you're kind of looking through, you know, these huge, great libraries, you know, what is it that is resonating with you? And then when it is resonating with you in a certain way, you can start to evaluate what that is. So the first thing is to place the emphasis on how it kind of works within the context of the project or the brand that you're working on, and that its design then fits the intended use. So the next thing is, like, you might have this really awesome typeface that's got loads of character, loads of personality, and it's going to be amazing for the logo, but actually, oh no, we actually need to set some body text with it. It's going to be completely disastrous for that. So you need to consider it from that perspective. And then going into its design being comprehensive. So I talked a bit about multi-language support, where you have some fonts which don't have a decent coverage of language within the glyph set, and then you get these really obvious, or maybe not so obvious, but these weird, like slightly jarring fallbacks coming in there. about it containing legible details. So a lot of you, I'm sure, know about this test of making sure you type an uppercase I, a lowercase l, and the numeral 1, or also checking legibility. Again, I spoke about earlier about whether things are mirrored, having a D and a B, a Q and a P. Also, there are some other legibility considerations. So that one that Vitaly linked to earlier on, checking like how an uppercase B looks next to a numeral 8, this kind of thing. So ultimately, whatever we're doing, we need to, and type needs to be readable. Like, it can be the most beautiful bit of type in the world, but it's got to be read. And so that should always be the consideration. Now, obviously, you can get away with some stuff if you're maybe doing like a logo or something that's completely in isolation, and that's okay, because that's bearing in mind like what the context of the product is. But looking through, or trying to find a way to evaluate it. What else we got? We got looking beyond. So making sure you got the basic weights and styles, because you don't want to commission, so you don't want to use a typeface for your whole design system and then suddenly find that it doesn't have an italic. This is something which bizarrely you see a lot of. I'm kind of still upset with The Verge, because they've still got a faux italic on their website. It bugs the hell out of me. They've got a lovely website. I love The Verge, one of my favorite websites. It's beautifully designed. But that particular typeface that doesn't have an italic. Like the design, as far as I know, doesn't exist. So because of that, you're never going to get a true italic in there, because the browser is always going to do that artificial slanting. So making sure you've got a good coverage of weights and styles is important. And then going on to like evaluating whether it's got even more stuff that you can use, like alternate glyphs, open type features, different types of numerals, contextual alternates, this kind of thing. Going on to like whether it's got more weights, which again comes into the whole variable font thing, or grades even. Grade is like a little bit more down that rabbit hole, but kind of being able to tweak the type in certain ways for different contexts to account for, say, different paper stocks, light or dark screens, this kind of thing. Multiple widths, even better, because then you can start to use something that stops you having to jump to a secondary typeface, because you've got the whole thing within one family. Optical sizes as well, so you can optimize for different, for body size text and for display style text as well. And then checking the actual font files for reliability. So like, are those features that you've identified that you want to have, are they actually present in the font files? Not all font files are created equally. So like, have you got like a pro version that has more stuff, and the other one that's coming from a different delivery network doesn't contain all of those glyphs that you need?
I have another question. How often is it that an organization, a publication, or a wholesaling company, a retailing company decides, boys and girls, we're going to have our own font. We're going to pay some artist person, font person. We're going to create our own self font. How often does that happen?
I wouldn't want to say like a specific figure or anything, but I mean, I'm seeing more of it. Like the commissioning of completely bespoke typefaces seems to be pretty healthy. I mean, if you look at Monotype and Monotype Studio, who kind of manage all of their kind of bespoke typefaces, there is a ton there where you see just a lot of brands opting for what will probably be pretty expensive projects, to have their own stamp, as I said before, where they can say that this is completely bespoke to us, that we're not having to reuse things from the reuse typefaces that other brands are using. I'm seeing quite a lot of it. I wouldn't want to say that it's necessarily happens all the time in the grand scheme of things, but I'd say it's like a fairly common occurrence, and it's how a lot of type foundries as well will make their money, rather than just selling retail fonts. They'll actually sell their services as designers to create something more bespoke.
I think it also depends probably partly on just what the brand actually wants. I mean, I see some organizations, some companies just trying to be very much present and very much unique. On the other hand, we also saw a lot of movement over the last couple of years of many big brands kind of transitioning away from their custom typefaces to very generic typefaces. I think there was this case where 5 or 6 fashion brands just moved to Helvetica.
Yeah.
and that was it, right? On the other hand, you see something else happening, let's say in the music industry, speaking about that again, right? Where like every single DJ, and I'm sure that Elliot belongs to that group as well, needs a special dedicated custom design typeface / logo to put on a poster. So that's kind of a different direction. So I think like for an artist, it might be like they probably don't design a typeface, because then their name is pretty much decides what it's going to be, unless they produce albums that might need to go in there. So it's just a logo, I guess, more than a typeface. But it probably depends on the purpose of work too.
But on the other hand, how do you balance these beautiful typefaces with performance? I think that's the flip side. That's why so many people have gone back to just Helvetica or system fonts or something that will make their site score higher in Web Core Vitals, so that they'll rank higher in Google or search engines.
Yeah, we had a question about subsetting as well in the chat, and so there are some ways of how to make things a bit faster, but surely, with a web font you get I mean, if you don't have any font files that are being loaded, then it's probably going to boost your performance with it. But even with subsetting with web fonts, you can still get very high performance score. Maybe some words of wisdom from you on that, Elliot. 3 minutes that we have to finish to wrap up. And also, if you could plug in a little hint about your wonderful workshop that's coming up soon, that would be fantastic.
Well, you know what? As I'm not super up on the very latest in terms of subsetting, and you're probably performance-wise much more knowledgeable on that topic, Vitaly, I'll leave that to you. But yes, yes, the workshop is happening next week, which is yeah, amazing that's come around so quickly. So yeah, if anyone's interested, it is a 2.5-hour session workshop that runs over the next 3 weeks. So on a Thursday evening and Friday evening for the next 3 weeks. Yeah, it's going to be fun. It's designed to be completely all comprehensive. Like it's covering from the very basics right the way through to very latest technologies and some web specific stuff.
But not subsetting.
But not subset. No, there is. There's some mention of subsetting in there, but you can supply some figures.
That's okay. That's okay. I mean, from my end, I'm just really always happy to see Elliot's articles and everything on type. So I'm very excited to be listening in, albeit passively, in the back. This is going to be an incredible workshop. I have no doubt around that. What will people actually learn in it?
Well, I
assume.
well, how to kind of take type from to look at even the the simplest of changes to improving typography, to right through to as I say, kind of implementing some of this stuff on the web and looking at all of the different considerations for different contexts, looking at design systems and the role that type plays within that. Even I think the sort of the simple stuff I like to go over. So even for folks who are kind of like maybe fairly experienced with type and perhaps been working in it for years, or they're designers rather than developers and sort of feel that they're kind of quite comfortable with it. I personally really enjoy going over a lot of the basic principles with people, because I think it's always good to see someone else's sort of interpretation, and I love hearing other folks talk about how they use these kind of seemingly simple things that we kind of take for granted, and there's usually some kind of spotlight shone on an area that you haven't considered just because it's sort of come from someone else. So I think it's going to be, the idea is that it's like right from basics right through to advanced, but it's going to be a load of stuff. I'm looking at the schedule today, and I'm wondering if I haven't given myself enough time to like cover all these different topics. It's going to be a big squeeze, but it's going to be nice as well, because in every session there's 30 minutes of us just having a chat and going over some stuff. There's going to be some homework setting, plenty of time for Q&A.
Who doesn't like homework, right, Elliot?
Yeah, exactly. It's going to be fun homework. I promise it'll be fun homework.
Okay.
And yeah, it's gonna be fun. So yeah, thank you to anyone who's coming along, and thanks for listening today. Thanks for listening to me waffle on.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining in. At this point, just one reminder that I think Jarain just posted in here in the chat that there are a few last discounted early bird slots available, so that's great. Huge thanks to Olympia as well for your kind words as well. Elliot, just one final words before we go. Will we be listening to some, I don't know, some tunes from your albums in the breaks between sessions or within your sessions?
We could do that. We'll like some subliminal buy the EP messages. Yeah, maybe.
No, I would say it can also be very respectful and kind and just making people think and be creative as they are designing. Maybe
something like, yeah, I've been told by a few folks that they think my music is good working music, so I'll take that as a compliment. Sounds good. Well, then we'll be tuning in, I would say. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining in. Huge thanks to Elliot as well for joining. Maybe I'll see some of you later, maybe in another workshop or so. And also thanks to Ryan actually staying all this time connecting from Hong Kong, which is where it is right now, like what, 3 a.m., 2 a.m.?
Oh, it's only 1 a.m. So it's
1 a.m. So it's not
early times.
Okay, so excellent timing to learn about type. All right, well then, thanks everyone for joining, and see you next time, everyone.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Cheers, everyone. Bye.